Good evening, Asia, good afternoon, Europe and Africa, and good morning, America. My name is Mark Lyman. I'm the Executive Director of the Universal Rights Group, and I have the honour to welcome you to this first session of RightOn 2.0, following the successful first season of RightOn. While the focus previously was on COVID-19, this time it is going to be generally on human rights questions. And another change is that previously we were meeting every week, but now we will be meeting once a month. So we will see each other less often, but hopefully have equally good discussions. Now, the subject of today's discussion is on communicating human rights, or even more, how to better communicate human rights, and as the tagline of the meeting suggested, how to win the global battle of ideas. Now, this is, I think, a relatively new subject matter for the international human rights community to discuss, but it's incredibly important. It really is such a crucial issue. Why is it so important? Well, firstly, it's important because we must counter global threats to the universal human rights system, or the universal norm-based system, and the international human rights system, especially from those who don't particularly like the United Nations or don't particularly like human rights, the world's autocrats, dictators, populists, and nationalists. And secondly, because the issue of communicating human rights speaks to public trust in the United Nations and in human rights. There's no or little point in the great work that many of you do in the world of human rights if, for the rights holders on the ground, that work is invisible, whether it's incomprehensible, or whether it seems detached from their everyday lives. In other words, if what we do here is irrelevant to the people we're trying to help and promote and protect their rights. It's actually quite strange in many ways that we haven't really talked about this before, and that the UN and the international community is not really focused on this. If you look at major corporations around the world, they have budgets running to millions of dollars focused on communications and media relations. I would say we have improved over recent years. For example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has an Office for External Relations. They've also started producing very good videos showing the lives or the lived reality of many people on the ground. The EU, a couple of years ago, came up with a new initiative called Human Rights Stories, which aims to show a more positive side to the impact of the international human rights system. But I think we're really only scratching on the surface, and there are reasons for that. One is that many states, or some states, don't want us to get closer to rights holders. They don't want us to communicate more directly with people living in their countries. But I think the bigger reason is perhaps that we've just not thought about it enough, and we haven't focused on it. So hopefully today will change that. So, today we have a great panel to kick off this first episode of a new Netflix season of RightOn. Firstly, we have Philip Alston, who's the John Norton Pulmonary Professor of Law and co-chair of the Center of Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University School of Law. We have Ms. Juana Quaitel, Executive Director of Connectors Human Rights. We have Friso Roskam Abing, who's Senior Advisor on Strategic Communications at the EU Agency of Fundamental Rights. And last but not least, Mr. Bruno Gusani, who's Chairman of the Geneva International Film Festival on Human Rights and the Global Curator of TED. As always with RightOn discussions, we hope everybody in the audience will fully contribute and send in your thoughts and especially your questions. So please do so starting now, if you haven't already done so, in the chat room. And then at the end, once everybody has answered the first round of questions, we will pose some of those questions to the experts. Now that we've introduced the speakers and given a lie of the land, we're going to start with a first simple survey question, which should appear on your screen now. The survey asks the following question: who do you think is responsible for the prevalence of negative media stories in the press? Is it journalists, or is it the demand side, so is the consumer? Do we only, in other words, are we only interested in bad news? So this idea in the video that good news is not really news. Of course, this is playing partly on the psychology of rights holders and people around the world. And so far we have well, 50-50, exactly both. And I think that's probably right. It is a mixture. Before every Human Rights Council session, we organise the Universal Rights Group a press breakfast with journalists, and we give them lots of potential stories relating to economic, social rights, related to issues like poverty and human rights, civil and political rights. And they're only ever interested in what's going on in Syria or Myanmar or places like that, which I think tells the story of 50% of the votes that have come in. Okay, so we're now going to turn to the first question, which is to our good friend Philip Alston, who was formerly UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty, and is now possibly enjoying a well-earned rest after that. Philip, the universal human rights and debates and decisions taken at the UN in Geneva and New York often, I think, appear incomprehensible or abstract to individual rights holders, detached from the daily reality of their lives and the challenges they face. During your time as Special Rapporteur, in my opinion, you really helped to change that and made the universal human rights system more understandable and especially more relevant for people, framing their struggles or sense of injustices in a human rights context. At the same time, you seem to have success in connecting with relevant national debates, whether it was about austerity, privatization and child poverty in the United Kingdom, or healthcare and tax reform in the United States, and making the work you did and the universal human rights system relevant to those debates. Was this a deliberate strategy, and what might the international community learn from what you did? Please, Philip.
Thanks, Mark. A great pleasure to be part of the panel. I guess the starting point, of course, is to say that the debates that take place in Geneva and in New York will never resonate, as it were, with a broader public. That's why one needs to have interlocutors, translators, however they are described, and that's where special procedures come in. It's where the Office of the High Commissioner should come in, but it is generally very constrained in much of what it can do. I think the starting point is the Syria analysis that you mentioned. In other words, if you talk about human rights, people immediately think, the major wars that are going on, the major civil and political rights violations that are occurring. In some ways, at least, that's our fault for failing to communicate that human rights actually covers a much broader array of issues. But as you rightly say, the challenge then is how to make that interesting. It's one thing to say, guess what, human rights includes a right to healthcare. And there are many of these governments that are doing nothing about that. That's not news presented in that way. So one has to think about how to frame it. in such a way that it does become interesting for people, and ideally that it does generate outrage. Now that's a strong word to use in terms of our type of reporting, but that's what moves people in relation to human rights, the sense that it shouldn't be like that. That is unjust. That is unfair. And of course, most people say that in response to torture or whatever, but the challenge for us is to broaden that out. And whether it's access to the courts, where there is no access in so many situations, or whether it's access of children to education, the challenge is to present it in such a way that people will respond by saying, but that's outrageous. I think to the extent that your question related to specifically what special rapporteurs and others do, I've got a couple of comments that might be relevant. I think clearly for special procedures, the challenge is to choose the issues. There's no point in writing about things that have been written about endlessly unless you think you can add value in some way. It shouldn't be seen as a pro forma exercise. I have to write a report on X. There's already tons of reports on X out there, and unless you can frame it in such a way that it is of interest or that it adds value, it's not going to contribute. I think one has to learn how to write reports. There have to be significant themes that run through the report. And one also has to keep in mind that there's got to be something worth quoting. I had very funny experiences with the Office of the High Commissioner, which would, in a very reliable way, go like a homing pigeon towards phrases that I had put in precisely to generate publicity. And they would gently say, Philip, you have to take out the following phrases because they're not appropriate for UN reports. And of course, that went to the very heart, because when they said not appropriate for UN report, what they were really thinking, although I guess they didn't articulate it even for themselves, was it's not sufficiently boring, banal, mundane to fit UN diplomatic language. It's real life language, and it's something that a journalist will pick up. That needs to be in a report. It's the only way in which a report is going to get broader coverage. Reports need to be critical, of course. That's much of what we do in the human rights area. But they also generally need to be optimistic in the sense that there is something that can be done. And here are the positive takeaways as well as the negative. Unremittingly critical reports are not going to be particularly well received. I think for getting coverage and publicity, one has to just bear in mind that the media never or rarely motivates itself. You have to go to the media. You have to get in touch. You have to let them know the report's coming. You have to let them know why the hell they should waste lines in their outlet on such a report. The bottom line for me for general reports is a lesson that is very hard to learn, and that is that the submission of a report is not the end of the process, but the very beginning. And the sad reality is that the overwhelming majority of us say, thank God I've finished that report and I can move on to the next thing. And it is such a self-defeating and foolish way of dealing with it, because a report doesn't have a life of its own. It doesn't take off. You're the one who has to provide the fuel to make it take off, and that requires a lot of attention and cultivation to keep it moving. Just a couple of other points, and then I'll finish. I think that country reports are a hugely underappreciated resource. Too many country reports are seen as pro forma. I have to say that I went to a country. I have to identify that there are a few problems there, and I've got to have spoken to some key actors, and then I can tick the box that I've put out a report on country X. That is a hugely wasted opportunity. But the catch is that to do a good country report takes a huge amount of work in advance. It can't simply be set up by a staff member of the Office of the High Commissioner. You can't simply arrive and expect to be given lots of information by people. You need to have a very significant background before you embark on the process. You also need, and this is much more work, of course, to tailor the report to the country concerned. I'll give you some very quick and overly general examples, but I went to China. Obviously in China, there's going to be no interest in civil and political rights issues. There is huge interest in poverty because it is genuinely a government priority. And there's also great pride in the fact that economic and social rights are at the heart of their strategy. So the report had to be focused accordingly. In the United Kingdom, you've got a long history of a welfare state and great attachment, say, to the National Health Service. But the notion of economic and social rights is largely alien, has been challenged by successive governments, and therefore framing a report for the UK is not going to be helped by bringing in a lot of international standards and other what are seen as foreign gobbledygook. It has to be related to the domestic debates over how the Brits themselves see what we call social rights. And finally, in the United States, again, no interest in economic and social rights, no understanding, despite the activity around the right to health, which is happily occurring now, but a very strong civil rights tradition and a genuine belief that those rights are very important. So my entire report was structured around the notion of civil rights and how poverty undermines those rights that every American thinks are absolutely crucial. So I think the bottom line is that you really need to identify local concerns. You've got to work out the way in which the local community understands these issues and frame a report accordingly if you expect it to be taken up. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. Very, very interesting. I'm British, as you can probably tell from my accent, and I can just endorse some of the things Philip said, especially about the impact of some of his very sophisticated, I think, even if OHHR may have had problems with certain words, very sophisticated communications techniques and engagement with the media. It was the results of your visit, Philip, to the UK. I've spoken at a number of conferences there on economic, social rights and poverty and austerity. And with individual rights holders, especially from the poorer, more vulnerable and marginalised communities, your visit and your report had a huge impact. And we saw that also echoed in the newspapers. And also, I think you spoke very well to one of the last points I made, which was that governments actually don't want us to communicate more effectively about human rights, especially when it's human rights in their own countries. And I think, again, we saw that very clearly with your visits to the United Kingdom and the United States, where you had various, as you know, a lot of pushback from politicians like Amber Rudd in the UK Parliament and Nikki Haley, ambassador of the US to the UN at the time, who basically said, you know, we don't recognize these criticisms, and the UN human rights system is actually there to look at violations in Africa and Asia, not look at things like poverty in the United Kingdom or the US. So thank you. I'm now going to turn to Juana. So in October, Juana, as you know, because you wrote it, you wrote a very good article in Open Global Rights, in which you explain that the rhetoric that rejects human rights, and particularly human rights organizations, defenders and activists, has been rapidly gaining traction in Brazil over the last few years. In the article, you explain how the then deputy, Mr. Bolsonaro, employed anti-human rights discourse to help impeach President Dilma Rousseff, at one point dedicating impeachment to Carlos Alberto Ustra, who was directly responsible for Rousseff's torture while in detention. And then he used the same techniques in a successful presidential campaign. A key feature of that campaign and his time in office has also been to use language that rejects and derides human rights. And yet, as we're also seeing, I think, in the UK and perhaps parts of the US, well, definitely parts of the US, this approach clearly resonates. Populist approach clearly resonates with large parts of the population in Brazil, especially in your article, you say the wealthy parts of the population. So what does your own research into these kind of trends around human rights and populism tell us about the nature of populism and its antagonistic relationship with rights? And what should the human rights community learn from that and do to use communication to fight back? Juana.
Hello, good morning. I'm in Brazil, so good morning here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for giving me the chance to share the panel with all the speakers, but especially with Professor Alston, who's one of the persons that I admire the most, person to whom I call when I'm lost, or what we should do as a human rights organization, who's always able to give us hope and has an amazing sense of humor. So thank you so much. I never thought I would have the chance to share a panel with Alston, and the day came. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. I don't have the answer. If I had the answer, I would be in another place. But I can share with you some insights. And I really think you should put this on the context of Brazil. So we've been dealing with the populist president for 2 years now. So I think your question is how to defeat populists who challenge human rights discourse. And you are asking that to a person who's like leading a human rights organization. And the first answer is, listen, we have a limited role in that. I know it's not the answer you expect, but I think the answer to populist leaders will come from politics, from elections, from the opposition, from political parties. And that's not our arena. So in one part, I think we have to assume our limitations. And if that's the role of the opposition, ask what is our role? And dealing with Bolsonaro for 2 years, I see our role as stopping the attacks to the rule of law, resisting every single day, several attacks per week, so sometimes several per day, and also defend the rights of the most vulnerable. And I think civil society in Brazil is doing that bravely. And in 2 years, new coalitions have been built, and we are fighting. And many of the things he was trying to pass in Congress, we've been able to resist and to show that they were very, very dangerous. So I've been using a concept by a professor from the University of Chicago. I think her name is Kim Schipeli. She describes this populist attack to human rights as authoritarian legalism. So what is happening here is that the president tries to make legal what was illegal, killing by the police, making that legal, having guns, arms, making that legal, and it's illegal now. And when he cannot do it, he tries to weaken all the mechanisms of control. So the role of civil society and the human rights movement in this context has been to stop him from making legal what it was illegal. And we've been quite successful. if you make a list of what Bolsonaro tried to pass in Congress and what he at the end was able to pass, the difference is huge. And when we cannot defeat him in Congress, together with the opposition, with the litigation, and also Supreme Court has been like putting a limit to him in many of his attacks. So my first point is, it is important to us to reflect on what we can do and what it's the role of the politicians and the opposition and political parties. Because my feeling is that all this discourse of the failure of the human rights movement is leaving us with little hope and a feeling of failure that is like draining our strength. So I think we are doing the right thing here, resisting. Having said that, I think there are things that we need to change. So your question and the whole debate is on communication. Is communication our problem? Is that we are not communicating well? And I will go back to that point at the end. But I am also thinking a lot on, so we have an issue of agenda, we have an issue of communication, and we have also an issue of composition. My answer to how we can defeat populist leaders is reflecting who we are. So who are sitting in the human rights mechanisms and the human rights organization? I know there have been a lot of writing about elitism, and I think there's part of the answer around that. My feeling is, at least with the organizations I deal, the issue of being closer to the people, even in the composition of the organization, is really important. So the answer is not coming from the most complex strategy. It's coming from who is leading the organization, who's doing the agenda. So in a country like Brazil, for example, where more than 50% of the population is Black, organizations need to be Black. So the issue of race in this moment all around the world should make us ask ourselves, how are our organizations composed? Who's leading? Who's deciding? Who's working? If our causes make sense for the people in the organization, they will make also sense outside the organization. If the organizations reflect the population. If it's not what an Egyptian friend used to call the LLM generation. People who, from the very elite, who speak foreign languages, who go to Geneva, New York, London to do LLMs and come back and lead organizations that are not very rooted in their society. So composition in terms of race. That's something we should talk about. The second issue, and it's related to this populist attack to rights, is religion. At least most of the organizations I know are very atheist. We have a relation with religion as an important component of life that is complex, to say a word. And if you look Trump and you look Bolsonaro and other leaders, the issue of religion and calling the others atheists and anti-religion is at the roots of the attacks. So I think we should have ask ourselves, think, read, listen more to religious groups that are leading many things in the lives of people. How can we be a relevant human rights organization if we don't understand that religious issues are really important for everyday life? How can we not give value to those beliefs? And that's something that is happening in Brazil. And I think it's something we are thinking, reading, and studying a lot. And the third is also political life. I've been thinking a lot if this very technical view of human rights is the right thing we should do. I'm saying that the solution will come from politics, why we don't have people who come from politics in our teams? People who have the thinking, like, for example, people who can lead meetings with more than 200 people, who can lead a manifestation in the streets. Less technical in the side of the legal work and the languages and the writing, and more on dealing with people. So race, religion, and politics, for me, are very important issues to discuss in terms of the composition of the organization. I think if we change our composition, we will be better equipped to talk to people, and we won't need the most expensive communication agency. The second thing is related to the agenda, and that was in your concept note. Yes, we need an agenda that it's important for the majority.
If you could wrap up soon with this first.
Yes. The issue of the of right to health was mentioned by Professor Alston, and I think the pandemic made people realize the importance of the health system, and also the importance of the WHO and multilateral institutions. So having an agenda that talks to everyday life of people is also important. And to end of the talking about the communication, that was your main question. I think organizations have been experimenting a lot, new communication, new ways to communicate. If you ask me if there's a second round, I can share with you some examples. My feeling is that organizations are not sharing the results of this experimentation. So you did this, what happened? Did it change the support? Did you do a poll to know if that is strategy? I'm talking about virtual reality, art, theater, cinema. So on communication, I don't think that the main point now is that we have to change the way we communicate. I think we have been changing the way we communicate. We have now to share the results of that, to rethink the next step. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. Lots of food for thought, and I know we've been getting questions in the chat room. So I'm now going to pass over to my co-moderator, Natasha, who will continue with the rest of the meeting. Natasha.
Thank you, Mark, for the floor. And I would like to wish a good afternoon to everyone and thank the speakers who have made their contributions so far. But before we actually move on to our two remaining speakers for the day, I would like to say a couple of things about how human rights were communicated visually as part of the RightOn initiative. So the visuals that you're seeing on your screen right now, they were developed by Diplo's Creative Lab, namely our visual designer and video maker, who are far more competent than me to discuss their work, but I will try to briefly explain the logic behind it. So basically, RightOn began in April of this year after the outbreak of COVID-19. And at that time, as most of you know, there was a lot of discussion on human rights. And we through our webinars, also engaged in the process. A lot of the human rights issues at that time, as our speakers have already raised, and in general, are communicated in a very negative way. And in relation to COVID, this is something that was somewhat expected, given that much attention was paid to gender violence, the decline of democracy, the rise of fake news, and violations against journalists. However, we at the RightOn wanted to do something more, something different. And without banalizing or trivializing the issues at stake, we wanted to communicate the underlying messages with humor, in some cases even with irony, but ultimately we wanted to find positive in the negative. So the idea was to go beyond the visual identity and communicate sensitive issues across the barriers that were already set, so to speak. So basically, this is in short what we wanted to do with RightOn, and on your screens right now you're seeing the work of my colleagues. But now, after this short detour, let us go over to Friso, our third speaker for the day, who can tell us more about communicating human rights, especially from a European perspective. So in 2018, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights published its 10 keys to effectively communicate human rights. And we were wondering if you can tell us and the audience a bit more about why the agency felt that it was important and necessary to tackle the issue of human rights communication, and if you can briefly explain what these 10 keys actually are. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Natasha, and thank you, Mark, as well, for inviting the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights and myself to participate in this important and indeed very timely webinar. Now, to answer your questions, in 2017, we, as a fundamental rights agency, thought it was necessary to do a rather painful self-critical analysis of our promotion work and the impact it achieved or it didn't achieve, as well as the environment in which we worked. And the conclusions we draw were the following: human rights losing public and political support, or even, as Mark said, is really under threat. There was a growing mistrust in experts and statistics, which was relevant to us as an agency as well, who provides expertise and statistics. You may recall the days of the Bank of England being called the enemy of the people, and other agencies were considered post-Brexit and the USA 2016 elections as really providing false, fake information. Interestingly enough, now with the COVID crisis and the climate change debate, there seems to be back trust in expertise. So let's make use of that. Furthermore, we had to note that there was far too little media coverage, far too little impact of the work. We knew we had to communicate, as all of us, in an increasingly complex digital environment. And as an institution of the EU, we knew we had to acknowledge we were a victim of institutional communication and basically the curse of knowledge. We knew too much, we wanted to say too much, and we said it in too complicated language. What we also knew is that communicating human rights widely and effectively, however, is essential if we want to successfully grow support for human rights as such, to influence change leaders and raise awareness. The reason why in June 2017, we brought together a big group of unusual suspects, actually not so many from the human rights world, but outside: epistemologists, cognitive scientists, linguists, arts people, data analysts, cartoonists, people who work in advertisement companies, PR companies, who sell on Monday washing powder, on Tuesday cars, and we asked them, how would you sell on Wednesday human rights? I recommend to all of you who are participating in this webinar, and it's great to know that this is from all continents in the world, to really check out that meeting report, which is available on our website, as I truly believe it's still relevant. But basically what their two main recommendations were firstly, on whom we should better focus on, a group which we have ignored to a certain extent, namely the general public. The public who, like politicians, media, and influencers, require a different communication approach. And secondly, on the how, the strong recommendation was your messaging needs to be simple, visual, and it needs to contain drama, in a sense. What we did subsequently was indeed, Natasha already referred to this, and I'm just going to show it to you, the 10 keys to effectively communicating human rights. A little booklet, which I hope is of use to you. Please download it for free from our website. Also noticeable, it is available in 24 EU languages. And I would reckon that Spanish and French and English will be relevant on a global scale as well. Now, I will come back to the keys in a minute. What we subsequently did was also, this is partly a response to Juana's request, which is we're not sharing enough as a community. We established the so-called Human Rights Communicators Network, a closed Facebook group of about 300 communication experts now. And I absolutely invite people who think they should join this to get in touch with us and to indeed be a part of that community, because that's also where we do share the promising practices. And then, as it is a closed group, we are also allowed, as it is a safe space, to share the stories which were not so successful. Now, the 10 keys, which I'll come back to now, actually next year I hope we can get to a second edition, which in addition to what the current 10 keys do, namely to spell out how we can most effectively communicate human rights, actually answers firstly 3 other questions. Why are we communicating? Whom are we communicating to? And what are we communicating? So very simply, key number 1 should be make the business case for human rights. And here, the webinar is called The Battle of the Ideas. And this idea is very simple. Human rights are our bread and butter. They are the breathe, the oxygen we need on an everyday basis to survive. So that's, let's say, our idea. We need to be so fancy. And I agree with Juana. The COVID crisis has also offered us an opportunity, I think, to a wider audience to appreciate what human rights are. Suddenly, because they were reframed, we couldn't exercise our rights. We suddenly understood, also beyond this human rights expert community, that we need them on a daily basis. Freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, access to healthcare, data protection. So let's make use of this very dramatic situation to actually better promote human rights. So firstly, make the business case for human rights. Why are we doing this? This will bring you to your second question, namely, who is your audience? It will automatically bring you there. We're traditionally not so good in identifying in a careful way, but currently with the strategic, data-driven, behavioral, insight-based communication, we can actually identify the audiences quite well. Thirdly, have you identified the audience and listened to the audience very well, know where they are and what they think and do, then you can identify your issues. Here, come back to also what Philip said, it's important, I think, that we should maybe do more work on social and economic rights. With all the justified focus we have put on political and civil rights and on protecting the most vulnerable, the Roma, the LGBTI, the migrants, maybe we have forgotten to also protect and promote the rights of the general population. So let's please do this.
Friso, if just you can wrap up.
I'll just give you two more, which I think are very important. It's important to give your message an authentic voice. The message counts, not your logo, maybe not your CEO, let a right holder speak, or a duty bearer, or an influencer. Also, embrace hope. We tend to focus on the negative, on the problems, but let's, as also Thomas Coombs, the human rights hope-based communicator, has taught us, let's use 5 shifts for better narratives. Fear to hope, against to for, problem to solution, threat to opportunity, victim to heroes. And finally, very importantly, I really would like to plead, particularly to civil society organizations, you need to reach out more to the unusual suspects. You can find partnerships in the corporate sector, in the arts sector, in the tech sector, in the sports sector. It will require a different shift of thinking, but if there is any momentum, I think it is now. So let's grasp it and let's establish strategic partnership for the wider promotion of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Friso. You raised many important points and you spoke about how complicated communication is with regards to human rights that is oftentimes encountered. You also mentioned the role played by drama, the importance of visuals and contributions of professionals like artists and cartoonists. And this actually is a nice introduction for our next speaker, Bruno, who is the chair of the Geneva International Film Festival for Human Rights, the world's biggest gathering that combines the two elements. And Bruno, we would actually like you to tell us about the success of this initiative in terms of communicating with a wider public audience, but also in teaching practitioners. In other words, the delegations to the UN Human Rights Council, human rights officials, and civil society representatives about effective human rights communication. Could you also perhaps, in answering, tell us and share with us how to use innovative techniques to push back against populist and anti-human rights rhetorics? The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Natasha, and hello everyone. Very interesting discussion so far. So a couple of points, and I'm gonna take what Friso just said and expand it, but it also links back to things that Philip and Juana have said. We are now in a specific time in history, which is, of course, determined by the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic and the continuous changes in our daily lives and our capacity to do things and to communicate things in traditional ways that are provoked by the restrictions that have to do with the pandemic. That's going to continue. It's not going to go away for quite a bit of time. So we are in a special situation, and I think we need to look at that not only as a situation that we need to cope with, or a situation that we need to navigate, but an opportunity or even more an obligation to rethink the way we have been doing things for many years now, which have become in many different ways stayed and not effective anymore. And actually the reason for this discussion is exactly that. So I want to talk about two organizations I'm involved with, and one Natasha mentioned, the other was mentioned in the bio, and because the experience of both of them this year leads to two different principles or two different approaches about how to communicate. The first one is indeed the Festival on Human Rights in Geneva. It's a film festival that takes place every year in March. It attracts about 40,000 people in normal years over 10 days. And it's a particular festival because it's not about showing films and screening films. It's about gathering people around the films and around the stories that are told in the films, and it's about creating specific spaces for discussion, spaces that are interdisciplinary, spaces that are transversal, that bring together young activists and UN representatives, politicians, and people from academia, and many other types of people, including a pretty high focus towards marginalized social groups and towards youth. So we organize screenings and discussions and trainings, for example, in schools. We have screenings in prisons, in retirement homes, et cetera, et cetera. This year in March, we had to cancel the festival literally 5 days before it was supposed to start. We had everything ready. We had sold almost all the tickets, and the Swiss federal government announced that events over 1,000 people were not going to be allowed. And so we had to cancel the event literally on a Friday, when the event was supposed to start on a Thursday the following week. And what we did is we tried to cancel positively, meaning our message was, we're going to cancel the actual gathering, but we're going to restructure it. And by Monday, you will get a new program, which is going to be partially digital, and partially, for the part we can still keep, is going to be still physical. So we kept what we could do in presence within the conditions of the time, in small groups with social distancing. So we kept some screening for the schools. We kept a workshop for emerging filmmakers, which is also part of the role of the festival, etc. And then we created an alternative digital program, particularly with discussions on a set of human rights related topics. And we tried to find some creative ways to show some of the films. Of course, we had the permission to screen a film in a theater. We didn't have the permission to put a film on YouTube for obvious reasons of rights. But we found ways to allow people to see at least some films. One, for example, is that we negotiated with the national television broadcaster to change their programming and show 3 of the films that were in our original program as part of their programming over the 10 days that were originally intended to be the 10 days of the festival, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you look at what we did there back in March, with 6 months of Zoom experience that we all have, it looks pretty basic. I don't think that it will actually gather a lot of applause today. But at the time, we were the very first organization in Switzerland to have to cancel their big event. And so people found that turning around from physical to virtual actually was a very good thing. But the point I wanted to make by telling this story is, what we did was nothing magical and was nothing super impressive. It was just that we had lost our main tool to do what we are supposed to do. We are a foundation focusing on communicating human rights, denouncing abuses, and promoting solutions. And so we lost our main tool, which is public screening and public debate. But we didn't want to let go of the mission. And so we just found different ways to try to keep our mission alive and to fulfill it as much as we could. So the first thing is, in a situation like that, but in every kind of situation where your communication doesn't work, stick to the mission and don't focus on the tool, right? The tool can be changed, can be reimagined creatively, etc. What matters is actually the mission. The second organization I'm involved with is TED, which you probably or maybe know because there are a lot of videos online called TED Talks that are quite popular. It's a nonprofit. We manage this big online and offline platform. The online part is 7 or so billion views a year. The offline part is conferences and gatherings, global and local. There are, in normal years, up to 3,500 local events under the TED brand around the world in pretty much every country. So it's a big scope. And of course, a lot of what we do as core of our activity, which is gathering people in big conferences coming from all over the world, has been wide adapted this year. This year, we have had 0 physical conferences. Actually, our main activity, which is conferences, is technically legal in many countries still today. And it's going to continue that way at least until mid-2021. So we shifted online like everybody else. But we try to experiment. Yes, I have just 2 minutes to go.
Okay.
But we try to do it experimenting with different formats. And the reason for that was that instead of just shifting the content, meaning there is somebody talking from a stage to an audience, let's just put that somebody in front of a camera talking to an audience, we try to shift and to recreate part of the experience that goes with the conference and part of the same way of engaging audiences. Anything from serendipitous meetings that you have in the corridor when you're at the conference and you can have on specific tools online, to discussions, private discussions with the speaker, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the other principle we try to use. Don't focus only on shifting the content to digital, but also try to recreate some way to re-engage the audience that replicates, at least at some level, what would happen if they could gather physically.
Thank you, Bruno. You mentioned something that is very important, and I think most of our participants can relate to this, and that is, you said that you lost your main tool for what you're meant to do, but that the answer lies in innovative and creative ways. And I think this is something that that is not only important for the film industry, but I think many organizations had to look for innovative and creative ways in order to conduct their work. But thank you so much for raising this point. Now we will move on, and this is the interactive part of our today's discussions. We will bring in questions from our audience. We have actually allocated the questions according to our speakers. So we will start with Philip first, if you can answer in a minute or so. The question is the following. It was raised by Emmanuel Bernard, who asked, to what extent are individuals able to represent themselves in the international system? And can social movements such as Zimbabwe and Lives Matter reach the agenda of the United Nations Human Rights Organization? Philip, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Natasha. I guess the system, the UN human rights system, does have a number of ways of facilitating access by individuals. There's a very good organization called the International Service for Human Rights that's based in Geneva that is really dedicated to trying to facilitate such direct engagement by individuals. But the thing to keep in mind also is that the UN human rights system consists not just of the big meeting in Geneva, which often doesn't really come to grips with a lot of the issues, but it consists of the much broader network, and particularly the system of special rapporteurs. There are something like 44 special rapporteurs dealing with specific issues, and they are all dedicated to trying to bring individual voices out and give them some role. So I think it's very important to engage with them, and often cheaper and much easier in order to really get something into and out of the system.
Thank you, Philip, for sharing this with us, and I hope that we answered Emmanuel's question. We're going over to Juana. She has received a question from Veronique, who asked, how can we bring stakeholders from the private sector and the political arena together to support the same cause? Juana, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that question. I think that is crucial in the situation of Brazil. The piece that Mark quoted at the beginning was a study we did to find out why Brazilians don't donate to human rights. And we did a focus group and a survey, and what it came is that there's an initial resistance that can be like overcome by conversation and explanation. So the result of the study is that there's not such a real resistance to human rights. And that's in the side of sustainability of the human rights movement in Brazil. In terms of the agenda, we have seen recently huge movements by the business sector regarding the Amazon and the environment, less about indigenous peoples or institutional violence. But there was a letter by CEOs of several big companies and investors regarding the damage of the Amazonia and deforestation, calling the government to change its policy. That was huge. And we are like learning from that experience to invite them to come to the conversation and giving support, for example, on the issue of protecting indigenous people from COVID in the Amazon. So I think there's a big agenda on doing that invitation in the right way, and that means listening more. I think we as a movement, we are quite like talkative. We come with our finger like this and tell people what they should do and what they should think. And we need to listen more. Why the agenda is not like matching their agenda. And on the, sorry, one point more. On the issue of business in Brazil, I think the human rights movement need to show better how this president, for example, is threatening the basis and the main pillars of the rule of law. It's not still clear for them. They feel we are in a normal democracy, and I'm not feeling that we are in a normal democracy. So I think our role is to put that with research and documents and papers and articles more clear for them.
Thank you, Juana, and thank you for bringing in the Brazilian perspective. I will try to be very quick since we have a minute left, but we can slightly extend that. And we have a question for Bruno from Mina, who asked how to effectively reach different generations as they consume news and media in very different ways, and also often have different perspectives from where they engage with the message. So Bruno, if you can in 1 minute perhaps answer the question.
three quick things. The first one is none of us in this call probably have any idea what's in the cell phones of teenagers and young people in their early 20s. And what's there is not what comes from newspapers, is not what comes from CNN, is not what comes from human rights organizations. It's actually stuff that circulates kind of organically on Snapchat and Instagram and so. And we should actually study that to understand what they pay attention to. Mostly the format, and this is the second point, is video. Video matters a lot in today's media landscape. Mark said it in the beginning, there would have not been a post-George Floyd explosion in the US if there wasn't a video of his last 7 minutes. We can recreate some of them with written text and reports, but never to that extent. So video matters a lot. And the third point is, to go back to Philip's point about outrage, I don't think that the shock factor plays a big role unless it is supported by visual evidence. All the rest seems to be falling in the middle of a big noise that surrounds us right now, and where it's very difficult to get through.
Thank you, Bruno, for answering the question. And we are going over to Friso with the last question that we received from Omid Alizadeh, who asked if, since it is difficult to change the press policies, he asked, is it better to build up resilience and then counter anti-human rights discourse through strategic communication? And what has been the agency's approach to this?
I hope I understand the question well. That's what I could in any case say. And just to repeat what I said before, the importance of not forgetting that human rights are in themselves very positive, that we need them, we use them to make societies better, more equitable, more fair, and that you therefore have positive stories to tell. It's quite important, as also Philip had said, that you always offer the perspective of hope. And whereas we will sometimes need the noise and we need to uproar, and we need to definitely not hide the facts as they are, what we haven't done enough is to actually make that business case for human rights and really explain well that human rights are part of the solution and not the problem.
Thank you, Friso, for your answer and for this very quick but very concise answer where you raised that human rights have a positive story to tell, and I think it's a good way to finish this this week's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our audience and to our participants for their excellent contributions. As Mark already explained, this year's format will be slightly different, so our discussions will be on a monthly basis. However, we do have some special webinars prepared in ahead of us, and the next one will be on the 30th of September, which is co-organized with the Danish Institute for Human Rights and will address SDGs and human rights and how they can lead the way in the COVID-19 response and recovery. Thank you everyone for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.